So I'm Drew Johnston. I'm the president of Energy Thought Summit. We are starting Chapter 3 of our event here. In Chapter 3, we've gone over stewardship, policy, regulatory, and standards. We've gone through smart spaces, everything from microgrid to smart buildings to Internet of Things. What we're going to do next is we have that as the baseline of where we've come from and where we are today. The next part of this the next chapter is Invention and Innovation. And we're going to have a great panel. But before that, what we want to do is we wanted to just do a quick rewind about how Chicago came to the point that it's at today and what it's doing from this day forward. And we decided to put two individuals who are essentially titans in their respective fields, and they won't say this, but they were pioneers who stuck their necks out in ways that a lot of us can't comprehend to make sure that this opportunity, this day of opportunity, was there for all these other folks that you're hearing. And we'll see how much they share, but they're both very unassuming, and they're both, nose to the grindstone, hardworking guys, and I'm just so privileged to introduce them. Our moderator, we got the guy that founded the Blue Sky Innovation section for Chicago Tribune to do the moderating for this. Seeing as it's Chicago Innovation, it's only fitting that we have James Janica do the moderating. James is a senior consultant at Slalom Consulting, Innovation and Insights Group. He's a member of the Chicago Ideas Co-ops. He works with Fortune 500 companies, startups, venture capitalists, accelerators, and he works to help them find new solutions and sustaining capabilities. During 15 years at the Chicago Tribune, he covered science and technology, politics and breaking news, then developed the launch of the Tribune Blue Sky Innovation. But the Trib Nation engagement platform, I think, is one of the most interesting things he did, which was taking the Tribune and really looking at the whole masthead and what the customer and the city really needed from the Tribune. I think it's a real testimony to the work that he did, that work lives on today. He has an MBA with concentrations in entrepreneurship and strategy from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and he will introduce the two speakers. Without further ado, I introduce you to James Janega.
Thank you very much. The future is an interesting thing because you can know what customers are going to do and where technology is going and how mature the industry is, and you can still wonder down to your bone marrow what the next phase is going to be. Wise people have said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it, and our two speakers today know a little bit about what that feels like. The first is Dr. Jeffrey Chamberlain. He's the director of the Argonne Collaborative Center for Energy Storage Science Access at Argonne National Laboratory and the External Integration Officer in the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, or JCSR. He's a scientist and team leader with an eye towards connecting technology with the bottom line and social impact. He met Chicago's innovation ecosystem out of grad school and was frustrated that to find it fun to start up here before 2004, he had to go to Silicon Valley to find the funding. Things have changed. Argonne now partners with Clean Energy Trust, with the Energy Foundry, with CIE at the U of C, and through Argonne, he wants to collaborate here to achieve social benefit. He's got a hobby, too. He's trying to find out when the next revolution will come. And when he thinks about what would bring people to their knees, he stopped at an airport and saw somebody kneeling down trying to charge their battery on their cell phone. So please help me welcome Dr. Jeffrey Chamberlain. Our second panelist is Matthew Summey, another very interesting person. He's a vice president at Comcast, responsible for civic engagement for Illinois, Indiana, and Michigan, a board member at 1871, and previously a founder of the fund now doing business as the Energy Foundry. And was the CEO of the Illinois Science and Technology Coalition. Many of you may know him, and if you don't, he's partly responsible for why many of us are here today in terms of bringing a lot of the ecosystem together. He arrived at Comcast because of his role in fostering Chicago's innovation community and understanding how important all of its moving parts are. Comcast wants to interact with huge swaths of that ecosystem and looking for partners or inspiration to push the envelope. The outcomes he hopes for an ecosystem that scales. Please help me welcome Matthew Summey. Jeff, let's hear from you first. Tell us a little bit about what you're working on and what people should be thinking about right now.
Yes, first I want to thanks for the invitation and the gracious introduction. I'm very happy and honored to be here to represent Argonne National Laboratory, which I'll start by describing the lab a little bit before I describe my role. In case you don't know, there are two national laboratories in the Chicagoland area. One's Zpryme out in Batavia, out where I live, near Aurora. The other one is Argonne National Laboratory in Lamont, just a little bit southwest of the city. And Argonne has a regular budget of around $750 million, and we perform basic research that is aimed at understanding fundamentally the nature of the universe, up through applied research in developing new transportation vehicles, as well as understanding the operation of the grid. And what I'm really saying is we are a Department of Energy national laboratory, and we work on the national mission for energy. And there's a very wide variety of scope of what we work on, but the grid is a big part of it. My particular piece of it is we, at the lab, of our $750 million budget, roughly $40 to $50 million, depending on how you count it, is focused on energy storage systems. And by that, what I mean is we are working to and have experience and success discovering new materials that become parts of batteries and energy storage systems. That's at the very bottom level. We also do scale up of those materials so that we can transition them to industry. And we test batteries. We build batteries and test them in the system. And we have grid and car modeling, really excellent computer models that show how our innovations will end up fitting inside of a technology, one as vast as, say, the grid. So I lead the energy storage across the laboratory, that $30 to $40 million or $40 to $50 million investment across the laboratory aimed at the physics and chemistry associated with developing new batteries. And I could spend hours talking about all that physics and chemistry, if you'd like. But what I'm really excited to talk about here today is mostly I'm an industrialist. I'm a PhD chemist, but mostly I'm an industrialist and an entrepreneur. And what I'm excited to talk about here today is how Argonne National Laboratory and labs like it and universities can be leveraged within an innovation ecosystem like the one that has grown in Chicago during the last decade.
Matt, you had a lot to do with the growth of that innovation ecosystem with others, not only yourself, but with others over the last decade. Tell us about how Comcast fits into that now and your role there now.
Sure. So my role at Comcast is broadly classified as civic engagement. That helps me think a little bit about where we're going as a company, but all of that ultimately is derived from the work that's already happened in this ecosystem. We were just talking off stage a little bit about, and somebody asked a question this morning, how did the Energy Foundry really come to be? And it's a long story, so we'll share all the details offline someday if anybody ever really wants to read them. And we've got a journalist, maybe we'll write a real story about it. But the short story is really tied to what I do now, which is to connect the dots. For many years, I'd been part of the biotech community in Chicago, which was incredibly well networked. You had massive firms, Abbott, Baxter, and others that were very proud of Chicago as a home for the kind of innovation that they were involved in. And fast forward a few years to what's starting to happen around the grid. ComEd wanted to modernize, and what we found is that we were connecting the dots between a lot of really terrific research happening at institutions around the state, the Information Trust Institute at the University of Illinois, the great work at Argonne, things that were already happening at the University of Chicago and Northwestern. And rather than be a technical assistance provider to connect those individuals purely to ComEd to help them think about what they were about to undertake, the light bulb went off for a lot of us and said, there's something more happening here, and we need to get our arms around what it is. So we came up with the idea of the Energy Foundry, which really had three principles to it. at the time of conception. And it was really push, pull, and propel. So the push part of this was ComEd needed strategies, along with Ameren, on how to engage with institutional players in R&D as well as entrepreneurs. They also needed a strategy on the pull side to think about what does it mean to source these activities. They could put all the specs in the world, but if you're not thinking about what's coming next, you can't write a spec for it. So we needed a physical way to bring all of those things together, and that's what ultimately became the test bed. And then the most important part of all of this was propel, which for us meant there had to be the things that entrepreneurs and companies globally always want, which is access to talent, access to capital, and access to markets. So we thought the role of the Energy Foundry with seed capital would be to play the role of bringing together all of those pieces to be the center of an ecosystem. But in being the center of the ecosystem, that role had to constantly evolve, and that meant that companies like Comcast had to be at the table to talk to them about what they were looking to do so that it could be shared broadly, and that's how you get your arms around all of it.
Let's roll back the clock about 10 years and think about the way that the ecosystem was then, because I think a lot of people are from here, but many of them are not. If you were to try to recreate the system that exists now, where you can have these kinds of conversations, what were those steps that were important milestones?
I guess I'd start with history. 11 years ago, you said 10 years ago, I left Cabot Microelectronics with some friends to do a startup, a materials-based startup. And we were going to pull an innovation out of UMass at Amherst, and the place we needed to go to get funding was Silicon Valley. And we could not find a lab in Chicagoland outside of IIT, where the commute would have been horrible for us Western suburbanites. We couldn't find a space to operate in. We couldn't find the funds, and we couldn't find the space. And I'll leave it to Matt to describe kind of where we moved from that day, but I'll tell you, hearing Matt's introduction just now, I can give validity what he's saying about the glue that entities like the ones he's created have operated and enabled the ecosystem. And I'll give an example, and I don't know if full credit belongs, but I think it does heavily belong in the kind of glue that Matt was describing. Mayor Emanuel was the first mayor ever to visit the Argonne National Laboratory. And Argonne National Laboratory started with the Manhattan Project in the mid-1940s. So granted, Argonne's not inside the Chicago city limits, but if we're thinking about a broader ecosystem, we weren't connected into the Chicago ecosystem prior to the last 10 years. And I guess I would leave it at that to have Matt describe what they did to create that ecosystem.
Matt, how do you connect it?
So you go back 10 years and you think about what Illinois was facing economically, and we had a very quick recognition that while we had world-class universities and research institutions, we had not had a significant win in attracting a significant investment in a federal science project in a very, very long time. So along with some other folks, we got together, many of them from the lab, and we said, what's coming where we've got core competencies? Energy was one of those areas, and we went to work talking to folks on the Hill, talking to folks in industry about what may be coming in energy, and we started to plant some seeds in Washington and other places about what was happening as well in entrepreneurship and connecting the dots between the fact that Illinois had this robust history of innovation, but had not been as aggressive in commercializing it as any of us would have liked to thought. So we needed that big seed or big win from Congress and from DOE or DOD or some other institution to give us the opportunity to plan and to rally around that idea. We went after a couple of things and we did not succeed in them. The stimulus package came along. We went after a couple of things and we did not succeed. We tried, we failed, we got fast no's, and with each one of those we became a little bit more entrepreneurial, and we got to the place where we figured out what was missing was that we weren't outward looking enough. So you couldn't have commercialization if you weren't connecting with either consumers or industries in a way that the lab was turning itself inside out. There was a lot of mind shift, I think, going on at the lab at the time. Folks like Jeff were just really starting to get their legs about how they were going to connect with the outside world. But that all ultimately came together around J. Caesar, the Joint Center for Energy Science Research, which had components of commercialization, meeting a grand national challenge, and tying together the research institutions of Illinois in a joint proposal rather than competing against one another. And it's in those moments, and there were many of them, that that ecosystem really started to gel, and folks who had done research together didn't just become folks who were going to do future research together. They were on a mission, and that absolutely changed the equation.
Jeff, talk about that.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Matt's saying. Without that legwork that had been happening in the city, I think our prospects of winning the competition that became the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, or what we call JCSR, the prospects of us winning would have been lower. And that's a $120 million contract that we were able to pull in commitments from industry and the state government here in Illinois. It's all told a $175 million contract. And what Matt's talking about is the prospect of developing, we heard earlier today, the idea of a modernized grid, a more stable grid, an evolved grid that's connected to an Internet of Things. At least in our mind, we see a clear connection between the evolution of the grid over the next decade or two and the Internet of Things. Well, a key component, and in fact a key enabler of that, is storage. When you bring in renewable sources in particular, like solar and wind, you need to be able to store the electricity you're creating from those intermittent sources so you can use them when the clouds pass over, the wind stops blowing. And what Matt's talking about is when we had that outward look, so Argonne leads that large project, but our team spans from MIT in Cambridge out to Berkeley and Stanford in California. And we have some of, I would argue, the best scientists and engineers in the country, about 160 brains, working together as a unit. And there are 14 team members, and of those 14, off the top of my head, here are the ones that are in Chicago. University of Chicago, or Chicagoland, University of Chicago, UIC, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Northwestern, Argonne National Laboratory, and the Clean Energy Trust. We also have the University of Michigan, Johnson Controls right up the road in Milwaukee. So we have a really great team of basic researchers coupled with industry to create the kind of, or at least actually to capitalize on the kind of ecosystem that Matt and his folks built here in the city.
So we've got policy, we've got players from industry and government being aligned, the educational institutions being wrapped in, the national laboratories. Let's talk now about technology and some of the forefronts of that technology that you're working on right now. We've talked a lot about JCSR, and doubtless everybody knows quite a bit about it. Let's talk about some of the frontiers of that science and what areas that's unlocking.
Sure. I don't know how much folks in the crowd know about lithium ion batteries, but I'll bet you every one of you is carrying one right now. And whether you know it or not, you're performing a chemical reaction in your pocket, or in your purse, and it's a reversible chemical reaction. So when you plug in your device, you're actually reversing a chemical reaction. But what lithium does, if you think back to the periodic table in your days in chemistry or physics, it's way in the upper left-hand corner. It releases one electron every time you perform a reaction. So you need millions or billions of those reactions to create a current of electrons. And when you reverse that reaction by plugging your device into the wall, you pull electrons in our area from Exelon or ComEd and put them in your device. Now, one thing we're looking at is we're imagining a future. So the near future is advanced lithium ion. In the laboratory, although we have JCSR and we manage this large project across the country, about 2/3 of our work at Argonne National Laboratory is lithium ion. Because what's going to happen in lithium ion is they're going to get twice as good and half as expensive in the next 5 to 10 years with materials that come out of places like Argonne and MIT. But when we're looking 10 to 15 to 20 years down the road, we ask what comes next as the demands continue to increase. And we're looking at, to answer your question directly, we're looking at things like magnesium instead of lithium, with the simple idea that magnesium releases 2 electrons per reaction instead of 1. And there's a whole host of physical and chemical problems associated with creating a larger charge density around that ion when it's solvated inside the battery. But the simple idea is, could we use something like magnesium or even aluminum that has multiple charges and releases more electrons per reaction? And I could, again, dive really quickly into the deep physics and chemistry, but my point really is, from that simple concept, can we leverage something like the advanced photon source at Argonne National Laboratory or the supercomputer we have on site to develop a technology around fundamental discoveries to answer the question, can we use magnesium, that ultimately 10 years from now will result in a better battery than lithium ion.
Because that'll show you, in the one case, how many electrons can transfer, and in the other case, how strong a material needs to be to receive them without breaking.
It is.
I'm simplifying it, I think, very, very grossly.
No, that's exactly it, but the key is then connecting that science into this ecosystem, right? Working directly with industry and startups and venture capital groups so that we can move the science out into products.
What's that look like, Matt?
So you have to think about that on the entrepreneurial side as well as a company like Comcast's perspective in two ways. On the entrepreneurial side, we think often of what are we doing with all of these devices? There's conversations happening every day in this room, elsewhere, about IoT. But you also have to step back and think, what are institutional players doing in this space and what needs do they have? And it's not always just the consumer-facing portion of it. So for a company like Comcast, you may not think about these things, but we're a major holder of real estate. We are required under our franchise agreements with local governments to have diesel backup generators outside of our head-end equipments to keep the internet powered or your television or phone system powered at times of interruption. That's a real challenge for us. So we care in terms of uninterrupted power supply about where this will go. So thinking about just us, that's probably 70 to 90 facilities just in the Chicago metro area where we have that kind of equipment. So you think about the implications for industry, that then transits you over to what it means to you as individuals and the kind of conversation that was happening today with Ann Pramaggiore at lunch. Now, if you go back 4 or 5 years to hear the CEO of ComEd talk about pilot projects that are happening with universities in Illinois, that's a real sea change, and Ann deserves a lot of credit for that, but the folks in this room deserve credit because you're encouraging that work by being involved in this space. So one other transit point in that, kind of back to the Comcast side of it, the other requirement of energy storage or anything as we move to the demand side of the equation is the requirement of communications and networking equipment, which is the business that we're in. So if any of you are customers, hopefully you all are, you think about the dumb cable box in your house right now. Well, many of you hopefully have moved over to our X1 platform, which is an IP-enabled system where the device is connected in real time with the network. And you think about that multiplied by millions of customers, as well as the home security and home automation platform that we have. And I was just doing a little bit of math offline. And we probably have somewhere between 7 and 9 million devices connected to our network in the Chicago metro area at this very moment where we're communicating with that. All of those implications come with various opportunities for entrepreneurs. So you open up that system and you think from institutional player on the needs side to the consumer-facing portion of it where you're at scale, and entrepreneurs have to be part of it all along the way.
Yeah, Matt, something I wanted to ask you about that, and you went to the exact same spot that I was going to. As you have those kinds of connections into all of these devices, Comcast is an analog for a lot of other industries that are complex industries with a lot of these kinds of interconnections, has been foresighted in looking for those opportunities to interact with entrepreneurs, with business-to-business providers, with people that have innovative new ideas that can interconnect with a platform that you guys already maintain. How do you as a company set up that kind of understanding inside the company and outside the company? If you can, as much as you can talk about that.
Absolutely. We're in a very aggressive path to connect with more entrepreneurs and innovators around the country. You heard my former colleague Mark Harris talk about the Illinois Corporate Startup Challenge. You hear CET, you hear about Energy Foundry. You share your needs with organizations like that, and they play an important sourcing role for you. But innovation has to happen in so many different ways, and if your walls aren't open at all times, then you can't do it. So we are constantly looking to connect through co-working spaces, incubators, research projects around the globe. But a couple of points I want to quickly make too around sort of what's happening in this market in part. Chicago is a place where Comcast experiments a decent amount. So if anybody in this room is not aware, we actually have a partnership right now with Crius in this market, one of 2 places where we're doing work with Aries, and we're a marketing channel partnered with them, and we offer 2 energy products with them through the Energy Rewards program. There's a fixed rate program and a flex program, but we're already part of the energy reselling environment. We also have a pilot project right now with ComEd where our smart thermostats are part of a demand response pilot. So if you think about what it takes to scale to be behind the meter and in the home, there's a handful of companies that are already there and have been working on this for a number of years. Think of us as one of those, so when you've got ideas and innovations, we're part of that conversation for you.
Jeff Chamberlain, let me turn it to you. 7 to 9 million smart devices or devices in the homes, many of them smart devices. That's a lot of data that's coming out. That's also indicative of the kind of very sophisticated smart grid that people are creating right now. So with both of those in mind, I think in a previous panel, someone had asked about security. Let me ask you this in the context of security in the terms of resiliency, which is I think how Argonne likes to research this. How does your research in more sophisticated batteries tie into grid resiliency and security in that respect?
Yeah, the energy storage research we do specifically, if you're asking that, fits in the same way that Matt was describing that the various properties that Comcast owns, many of them have backup power capabilities in the form of fossil fuel with a turbine, I assume, so you can crank a turbine on and get electricity. But what we're aiming to do in our hopefully groundbreaking research is to develop a materials set and ultimately a technology package that competes directly with that fossil fuel consumption. So that resiliency for us from the battery perspective means that if the grid goes down, whether that's in a small place, an individual's home, or a larger place like an office building or a hospital, or even in a neighborhood or a whole city, that you could have enough capability to store energy to be a buffer for that. In fact, there was a big push in the government after Superstorm or Hurricane Sandy, whatever we call that, that imagine if we just had individual backup support in every house. And this also comes back to a big data question that you're kind of asking in your question as well. In particular, if you have medications, if you're diabetic, that need to stay cool and you don't get power for several weeks, then you're in trouble. But if every home had a small, inexpensive battery to hold electricity, first of all, day to day, I could buy power from ComEd or Exelon at night, which helps ComEd or Exelon at about 5 or 6 cents per kilowatt hour, as opposed to 11 cents per kilowatt hour during the day. So I could use the battery for that, but for resiliency, I could have my own personal backup. But here's the big question this audience should be asking themselves now. Can there be an operator like Comcast or a Google or a ComEd or Exelon that decides to integrate that dispersed resource of storage to make the entire grid resilient? So there has been a thought for many years of building giant multiple megawatt battery warehouses to store energy next to the generation source. But the growing thought is more like what we just heard Comcast is doing with telecommunication devices. What if we had individual storage devices that were all connected into the grid, but controlled in a way where that would serve the overall community in a resilient fashion?
That sounds like the frontier of where we're going, and with a minute and a half left to talk, let me ask you, Matt, where you feel like the frontier is in terms of smart grid for Comcast or for the people that you partner with, and then a final remark from each of you.
Sure. So for Comcast, and I think also for the individuals in this room and the Chicago market in particular, there's really 3 things that are out there as we go forward. Simplicity is going to remain a challenge. We've got millions of devices that are getting connected. All of them have various needs, but we're not all going to have 5,000 apps on our phone. So we've got to think about what that means as we communicate with the world at large. And as we move to spectrum challenges, we've also got issues there. I think everybody's probably heard the data point that by 2018 we'll be out of LTE spectrum. We've built a massive Wi-Fi network across the US. We'll, in fact, later this week get to about 10 million hotspots. There's lots of things that can happen in that, but you need the ideas to source. That's sort of part one, is think about simplicity for consumers and how you source that. The second part, I think, is absolutely a passion that I share with Jeff, and that's around energy storage. What do you do in the world of distributed generation? So I actually come from a public policy background originally, and when you talk about things that change the game, the renewable portfolio standard, things along those lines, it's time to have a very deep policy conversation, particularly around, do we need to have things like a grid storage solution that is embedded on the incentive side within state policies to start to draw out those kinds of innovations. You know, there's been multiple attempts in Congress. A senator from New Mexico, Heinrich, has recently reintroduced it. We're going to have that conversation. It's important for all of us to be part of it because it will drive massive innovation. So the policy part is 2. And then 3, we've got to make sure that as a community, we not only support one another, but that we share our best practices. One of the things that happens in entrepreneurship is you get that incredible exit, you get the examples of the PayPal mafia. We're starting to see that in Chicago in lots of spaces. We need to see that in energy, and the kind of work that Jeff's doing is going to drive that. We should all celebrate it, make sure the world knows that, and that we're all part of it.
Sounds like an exciting place to end it. Jeffrey Chamberlain, Matthew Summey, thank you both very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.